And Mike, if you don't mind just giving an introduction of yourself and then jump in and educate us.
No problem. Thanks, Taylor. So my name's Mike Burr. I'm based in Salt Lake City. My background is in biomedical engineering, is what my education background was in, and all my experience has been technically in ophthalmic, which is eye related to eye care, drug delivery. So that has to do with how we formulate molecules and specifically the rate, the timing at which we get those molecules to eye tissues. And so I graduated from college in 2011. I was enrolled in a PhD program for biomedical engineering, and I dropped out to start the company that I'll tell you about today, Ivina. Let me share screen here. So these slides are pretty simple, and it's just intended to be more talking points. As you know, any entrepreneur can tell you they develop war stories over the years, and so I mostly just have stories I can share, and hopefully, afterwards answer any questions. And I believe this would be interesting enough to the group to see how we started from where we were and to where we are today. We have all of what we do is in ophthalmology. And so my graduate school mentor was a physician and ophthalmologist. And we linked up pretty quick where we were interested in not just doing research that typically is done at a university where you get grants and then you fund more research and you publish, but we were both very entrepreneurial. We both also happened to enroll at the MBA program at the University of Utah. And so we started, Ivina was started in around 2010, and all of the technology that we have developed was done with the physician founder, my graduate school mentor, Dr. Balambadi, in his capacity as a research professor. And to date, we've raised over $22 million. And this has come from angel groups, individual physicians. We have several grants, and from a recent licensing transaction that we did with a large pharma. I can talk about this more, but just briefly, we've raised money from Salt Lake City Angels, Park City Angels, inherent to being an ophthalmologist with a practice or a professorship. You are probably qualified as a high net worth individual. And so we have taken several $1 million from individual investors. And so this has its pros and cons in that positively, you probably can get to know within your sphere, at least within the individual physicians, in this case, within our practice, we have a network of people that we know. So there's a lot of people that they regularly meet at conferences. So it's pretty straightforward to get people together, share your progress, and then solicit money. The con is you have a gigantic cap table, and sometimes institutional investors shiver and when they hear how many investors you might have on your cap table. We've been successful in obtaining SBIR grants. I think we have a total of between SBIR grants and state of Utah grants, I think we've raised about $5 million. And so that's all non-dilutive capital. So when you're raising money in the future, institutional investors particularly really like the idea that there's not other investors that are in your cap table, and that they're not having raised money at some outrageously low or outrageously high valuation before. And so non-dilutive money is almost always helpful. And then we recently did a licensing transaction with an ophthalmology specific company named Glaukos. They agreed to fund all development of an individual asset for a disease called keratoconus. Uh, the deal itself has about $100 million in milestones and upfront and payments, and there's a tiered royalty based upon future sales. So the makeup of our company today is we really only have about 5 key employees. Now there are a few techs and administrative people that also work with us, but the areas that we cover hit about every area that we need in the biotech area, where we have a physician, we have an expert in that's a pharmacist, as well as in pharmaceutical chemistry and formulation area. We have an expert in chemistry. I bring an engineering background, and now all of us, whether we wanted to or not, have a significant amount of business experience. We have a small lab in Research Park. When you meet with institutional investors and companies, I mean, to them, this is practically considered a virtual company, where we have so little overhead, given that the space at Research Park isn't very big and it's not intense on capital equipment. We maintain consultants that have experts in manufacturing, clinical operations, regulatory, and market access. And when you meet with venture groups, this is like the boxes you have to have checked, where you need a strong plan developed in every one of these areas for them to want to invest in you. And we also have an accounting group that helps us with things like HR and more operationally administrative functions. We have 2 IP firms that advise us, and then we have 2 legal groups that advise us as corporate counsel. So I'll this isn't a means for I guess everybody to have a successful company in Salt Lake City. Until recently, Salt Lake was a difficult environment to raise money for developing a molecule in either a pharmaceutical or biotech capacity. Now, there's historically been several medtech and medical device related opportunities that come up, but in this area, it's been difficult to, and it's not a traditional place where you would want to do this. And just to give a anecdote of how the industry is changing, when you're raising money and you're out of school and you don't know if your company's going to run out of money or if you're going to have a job in the next 3 months, it's one, and this is part and parcel for being an entrepreneur in almost any sector. It's difficult when you're married, and it's difficult when you have kids, because your future is uncertain. And recently I was out to lunch with my wife, and I heard these 2 guys next to me talking about, one was a biotech company that they were associated with, and then another was giving him advice because he was talking about changing jobs. And I wasn't paying too much to the specifics of their conversation, but hearing them tell their stories was just great. And I said, sorry to interrupt, your story's so interesting, and I work at a biotech. And the funny part is I spent years trying to convince my wife that I had a real job and that this was going places. And these guys knew about my company, and they knew that we had done a recent licensing transaction, and they were interested in connecting with me for future networking because of the success that my company has had. And so this is great, and it makes you feel good, but when you do it in front of your wife, it feels better. So I think the area in Salt Lake for this is growing, is my point. And you really have to decide what you want to do. Is this an idea? Is this an improvement on something else? It's not necessarily bad to be a Me Too product in some cases. Is this a very specific product for a very specific need, or is this a platform technology that could be applicable to lots of different, in my case, disease indications? And so from there, you have to develop a very specific target product profile. Even if this is a platform, you have to have a very specific, who's your customer, what disease is this, what age range of people would do this, is this something the government's going to pay for? Is this something insurance is going to pay for? Is this something that is paid for by individuals out of pocket? And once you have developed this specific product profile, you need to raise money to support your idea. And doing biotech, pharmaceutical related research does require a lot of facilities, and it can require to get to a minimally viable concept, proof of concept, it can require significant capital. And so this can come from the traditional sources. Like I said, we've been successful in raising money from ophthalmologist people within our industry. And I don't think if it wouldn't have been for that, and all that would require us to do is we would maybe spend $2,000, $1,000 hosting a breakfast at conferences, send emails to a curated group that has grown and grown over the years. And sometimes we've had a half dozen people show up, and other times we've had 20 to 30 people show up for breakfast. And we would just give an update. And every single time we've done this, we've left with checks that range from $10,000 to well over $100,000. In this space, the quality of your IP protection matters. For a while, we relied upon the University of Utah to help with that. And we worked with a local group that also works with the University of Utah called Thorpe North and Western. They have very good IP attorneys. And thereafter, we now work with a group based out of Boston. And but if you don't obtain IP protection, then you can't have a product. And part of when you're out raising money is you're selling hope because you have patent pending. But even early on, key decisions on what markets you decide to nationalize in. Very simplistically, a long time ago, we had, and it's changing, but we had the thought and some advice that it was very difficult to protect IP in China. And it became very apparent to us when we were out raising money, speaking to institutional investors, that having, for at least the market that we were in, having IP protection in China was absolutely critical to what we were doing. And so investing in IP early, it's very difficult to do because it can be very expensive, and bills can add up very quick, but it is critical to do in the biotech space. We've developed products for a niche market, and we're now developing a product for a large market. And you can have success in both, but generally, if you have a good solution that fits a market need in a large market, it's much easier to raise money. We spent a couple $1 million developing a niche product for cataract surgery, and it was more for high-risk patients receiving cataract surgery. Approximately 1 in 4 patients that get cataract surgery in the United States is diabetic. They are at higher risk of developing side effects. We had a solution that could prevent these side effects. While we were completing our initial clinical trials, 2 products launched in this space, and they did not launch very well based on Wall Street's predictions. And thus it became impossible for us to raise money in this sector, in this area. And part of it was because it was a niche product. And then finally, if you have a team that can execute on business and science strategies. And so part of the difficulty of people transitioning from taking your idea, putting it into a company, but how do you take the next steps? Raising venture capital is very, very difficult. When people ask me what I do a lot, is I tell them you travel around the world begging people for money so you don't run out of money. And so once you're able to obtain some seed capital of sorts and develop proof of concept, you have to do a lot in order to not run out of money. And so for that, you need a strong team that can execute. As I mentioned, we have people on our team that have decades of experience. We had some people on our team like myself that had virtually no experience when we started the company. And I think for that reason, you really need a strong board of directors, not necessarily at the seed capital stage, but even then it still can help. Many times if they're good and they recognize that your company needs capital, they will do so for options or founder stock. And a strong board of directors is necessary to guide you. We've brought in, so in order to move from initial capital into tens of millions of dollars of capital, we brought in 2 board members that had just come off a transaction where their company was rolled up into another company, and that new company wanted to spin out the ophthalmology assets. And so then the ophthalmology assets were purchased by a third company for $5 billion. And this ophthalmology asset and franchise, these 2 individuals had built from the ground up through a strategy of M&A and licensing from companies like Ivina. And so they know the story on the other side to take us there. And so without these board members, we would not have been able to do the recent licensing transaction. Key opinion leaders in ophthalmology are absolutely critical. There's at any, a dozen or so doctors that I can think of that speak at every conference. And these are these guru types that, and I can just say that if we hadn't had the scientific advisory board that we had, where they were intimately aware of our clinical trial data, we would not have been able to do the licensing transaction that we had. Part of the diligence that came directly from the CEO and board members and senior management of this company talking to our scientific advisory board. When we've been fortunate to know of and have a strong network where there's available resources. Just one example of this is there's a manufacturing group at the University of Utah that maintains GMP clean rooms. So GMP stands for good manufacturing practice. You have to have this in order to produce pharmaceutical products that go into humans for clinical trials. And they were very entrepreneurial and working with us in the earlier stages, and the amount of work that we got done with them, where we developed manufacturing processes from scratch to fully developed batch records and lot releases that have all GMP compliance, is astounding, given that many companies, if you outsource this, these are projects that can be well into the millions of dollars. You have to get creative with, again, the concept of not running out of money. One thing that we're currently doing is we're about to do a clinical trial in Australia. Australia has a program where they offer 42.5 cents on the dollar back for all research and development dollars spent in their country. Clinical research is a clear qualifier for R&D, and the contract research organizations really go out and market this in order to generate business for themselves. And we're going to do a pediatric trial for nearsightedness. So that's usually for most kids that are wearing glasses, that it's nearsightedness. And if you've dealt with it over your life, you know exactly what it is. And the idea is to prevent it from progressing worse and worse over time. And we're doing about a 200 patient clinical trial. And so the concept of being able to save 45% of every dollar spent is tremendous, given that this means for us that we don't have to go out and raise additional capital, and that we can use the proceeds from our recent licensing transaction. And
Mike, I want to make sure that you've got some time for Q&A.
Sure.
There are a couple of questions in the chat, but
Okay.
would love to maybe have you jump in on answering some of those questions, and then
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, that was it.
Oh, awesome. Well, sorry to cut you off there then.
No, that's it.
The how-to of some of those would be really interesting on that last slide of just kind of how you did that. One of the questions I see is how did you begin to build your list of investors, buyers, and how do you maintain and grow it?
So part of building a list of investors is you want to attract people to your board of directors that know other people. And so you know, getting in touch with venture capital is very, very difficult because you can't just like solicit cold calls and cold emails. You know, you can, and you can raise money that way, but it's very difficult. And so you really need to get introductions from people that know people. And so the way to get a board that has these, that is credible and that has their own Rolodex, is to build a quality management team. And so our initial founding management team has, each of us have a few people that we know. And then and when you're able to generate some successes, it begets more success, where we knew a lot of ophthalmologists. We raised money from ophthalmologists. And then when you go pitch someone for a bigger raise where you're trying to solicit, just say a couple $1 million, you can say, gosh, we've already done this because we were successfully able to do this from technically minded individuals that understand our domain.
Very cool. Open it up to other questions. If anybody has questions, feel free to unmute yourself or throw it in the chat. I'll pause for a second before I jump into a question I had.
I've got a question, Taylor. Excuse me. Yeah, Taylor. Do we have a shortage of wet rooms here? And if there was a facility to come into Utah where emerging med techs and biotechs could have accessibility to like a shared lab wet room, more so than what we already have, like maybe a CIC, which they have at MIT, the Cambridge Innovation Center. Mike, could you see that as something that could help accelerate some of the companies here?
Yeah, so this does exist here in Utah, and there are incubators. The old Recursion space, the on campus before they moved downtown, has been turned into an incubator with the collaboration with the University of Utah. The name of it escapes me, but we've seen over the years several similar spaces as well. And it generally includes a sort of benchtop type space to where you can rent several bench tops to like a room or two to yourself, and it just depends. And so we've never personally done this, but these can definitely help accelerate in specifically the very early stages, which these facilities were unaware of, 10 years ago. At least we were unaware of them 10 years ago, when we probably could have used them a lot more. And so these spaces do exist. And I think what you get from that is about not just space to do your work, but the networking. And so if someone there might know how to do something that you don't, they might have introductions to people that can help for other things, even beyond just getting your science and wet lab bench work done.
That's good to know. Other
Caleb,
questions?
do you know the name of that space now? What's it called? What it's called?
BioHive?
Well, I know BioHive, but they have like a specific incubator.
Altitude Labs?
Altitude Labs, that's it. Yeah, so that's a name that comes to mind. And we had spoken with them and interviewed before with them. And unfortunately for us, we were just a little late stage to want to take on that, given that we had already raised a significant amount of money, and it didn't make sense for us at the time. But my experience with them was that they were great, and that this is something that could help someone in the early stages of their product development.
Yeah, definitely. Other questions?
I do. Hello. Mike,
Yeah, hi.
you have a recommendation for where to find and screen grant writers? Because in the biotech field?
Yeah, so I don't, but that's the thing. I probably know a lot of people who do. So we've been very fortunate to have our internal team is very successful at this. So originally, Dr. Ambati, he has been very successful at obtaining grants as a professor. And we have we've written all of our own SBIRs. And so whatever we're doing seems to be working, and thus we keep doing it. We just got another phase 1 SBIR, and I don't know of services. Maybe Taylor does. I know that there was a woman, Mary Carden, that used to do this, but I think she recently retired. But they have a service that can help with this.
Alan, it looks like you could connect with Joel. He may have some.
Yeah. Well, there's the group RSI, which is based out of Layton, has a contract with GOE as well as Rural Innovation, and they can have accessibility to the grant writers that help with the different medical as well as military tie-ins. That it's at a vastly discounted rate, and they know their stuff too because they've come through. So the mill and with Colosimo, what's her first name? Taylor, I forget. The Beth Colosimo. They've got some amazing resources down there. And if you're able to either like plead poverty or whatever the cause is, it's something where it's still going to cost you, but at least it's not going to take an arm and a leg.
Awesome. Well, maybe one last question that I had for you, Mike, and then we'll close up shop for today. But while you have been raising funds, what were some of the hardest questions for you to address with that investors asked you, and why were they the most difficult questions?
Yeah, so we went through diligence with a couple of companies and deep diligence with several venture groups before we decided to take the licensing agreement. And to me, that was always just like they ask a question and we're able to answer it. And if you don't have a good answer, you put your heads together, and we're all smart, or at least we think we are, and then we come up with something. And I always, the most difficult is actually when you kind of nail it and someone's like, gosh, this is phenomenal. Your science is great. But we just want to see a little bit more. And so that's the investor saying, well, I just want this to be a little less risky for my investment appetite. And well, to de-risk something, you need more money. And so the currency that we use to raise money and to convince investors that this is a worthwhile investment was clinical data. And so clinical data realistically costs millions of dollars. And so you go out and say, gosh, I need $20 million or whatever to do these clinical studies for these 2-3 products, something that's a very typical venture pitch. And sometimes there's lots of venture money floating around, and there's these outsized Series A's, and sometimes there's no venture money and it's very tight. But you frequently would hear, gosh, this sounds really interesting. And it's not like I think, they genuinely mean this, but it's like, you're going to have to come back to me with more data. And it's like, well, I need at a minimum $3 million to generate that data. So I think that's the hardest part and that's why, I tried to provide some anecdotes of, well, this is how we kind of cross this gap to where, recently I just got back from Oregon Healthcare Conference, and it was the most interesting to me, where we met with all these investment banking groups about future transactions. And we start the presentation saying, okay, so we're not here to ask you for money. And there's a capital crunch right now for a lot of companies that are running out of money that may have good science and good teams. And they, just the environment of today's landscape is that a lot of companies are running out of money. And so to start our presentations with that, saying we're not here to ask you for money, we're building a relationship. We'd like to do an IPO in the next couple of years. It is tremendous. But getting that initial clinical data that really gives you that boost is very difficult. And so there's no good answer to it, where you're like, give me, we need to see some clinical data. And it's like, well, great. And, we did lots of interim analysis on our initial clinical trial. And, you know, we go back to the people excited saying the data continues to look good. Our drug seems to be working. And then they would say, well, you know, we'd like to just see a little bit more. And it's the chicken and the egg, and there's not a good answer to it.
That is hard. Well,
Yeah.
you and your team have done an amazing job over the last 10 years.
Thank you.
And yeah, I can't congratulate you enough on what you've done, Mike. Well done.
Thank you.
Thanks for spending some time with us today, Mike. If you're
Absolutely.
willing to share your presentation, Hannah could distribute that to the attendees here. But otherwise, if anybody has additional questions, can they just reach out to you on LinkedIn, or what would be the best way to connect with you, Mike?
I'm just on LinkedIn, Mike Burr, I think. And so, yeah, I'm happy to connect with people offline. And I think it's just great to connect with people in Salt Lake. And like I said in that story, you know, I was at with my wife. It's new to me, where I meet plenty of people when I'm in San Francisco and you know, these traditional Boston, these biotech places. But in Salt Lake, when you hear conversations about you know, a startup, and it's really exciting. So, but
That's
happy to
awesome.
connect with anyone offline as well.
Cool. Well, thanks, Mike. Really appreciate your
Yeah,
time. Thanks
absolutely.
everybody for coming, and we'll
thanks.
see you all next week. Thanks,
Okay.
Mike.
Bye.